The legal issue as to that we need to discuss is whether copyright in those works is infringed by its use in relation to AI. It's not the only legal issue, copyright, but it's the main one for these cases. And over the years, I have advised businesses on web scraping generally. So it's not as if it's presenting new issues, but what's curious is that suddenly copyright has become much more significant. In the past, we'd advise clients and say, well, look, what are your big concerns? And they would say, data privacy, yeah, we know copyright's a risk. Tell us about it, but we can mitigate it. We're much more concerned with getting fined 20% of our turnover. So copyright has come into play in a way that's quite important. And I think copyright owners have recognized that there is sort of value in what they're doing and how their works are being used by large language models. So from a copyright perspective, there are principally, I would say, three issues. The first is when you use a copyright work to train an AI model, does that infringe at the input stage? The second issue is, well, if it does infringe, or at least in principle it infringes, and you don't have the authorization of the copyright holder, does a copyright exception apply? Now, exceptions are quite an interesting creature. Charlie touched upon those in his talk. We've got fair use in the US, which is a fairly flexible exception. It's not really settled, and there are divergent views as to whether it should apply in the situation where data models, where data is being used to train AI. There is Article 4 of the Digital Single Market Directive, and this has two principal qualifications. It's an exception for text and data mining, but to rely on it, the person has to have lawful access to the work, and it's open to the right holders to effectively opt out of that exception. The UK at the moment has an exception which was introduced in 2014, and it's very narrowly circumscribed. So it only really applies to text and data mining for non-commercial research. The government did attempt last year to introduce a much more broader, permissive and AI-friendly copyright exception, which, if you think of the EU one in Article 4, it was like that, except right holders did not have the option to opt out. So it was very permissive and it was very AI-friendly. And in some senses, that wasn't surprising because the UK has its own national data strategy and national AI strategy, one of the principal tenets of which is to facilitate and foster access to data and use of data. So it made sense. Unfortunately, for the government, I guess, it was, I wouldn't say shot down in flames, but it was met with trenchant resistance from the creative industries. And it was effectively abandoned following a parliamentary debate. I think it was in February. So where does that leave the UK? Well, you may think that it leaves it at a competitive disadvantage compared to, for example, the EU and the US. And that's hardly surprising because we're only left with a very narrow exception. Again, as Charlie mentioned in his talk, Sir Patrick Vallance issued a report in which he recommended a code of practice. Obviously not an exception to copyright as such, but a code of practice designed to foster the use of material as inputs for training data for AIs. The government, I think, has taken him up on this and proposed to issue the code of practice in the summer. So we'll have to see what that looks like. But essentially, the focus of the code of practice is at the input stage to facilitate and foster use, and then focus copyright enforcement at the output stage. I'm sure our panellists may have some comments on that. The previous exception was effectively abandoned because it was expecting too much of right holders. I'm not quite sure how this will differ. We'll just have to wait and see. The third point is really copyright in the outputs, so the output that you receive once you've typed in your prompt to the AI model. And the question, I think, which is relevant there, or the issue which is relevant, is the diffusion models. They're not really like traditional databases. So the diffusion model doesn't contain a database of the works. So there aren't copies of the works in there. What the model does is it memorizes those works, and it does it in quite a clever way, certainly for text-to-image generation. What will happen is the image files are corrupted by adding noise to them, and then that noise is effectively used by a neural network to reconstruct an image, not the image, but an image. It's essentially providing you with a statistical approximation of the data that it's been trained on. So they're not databases, so they are storing memories at best, to use the vernacular that Charlie mentioned. Having said all of that, it's known that sometimes the outputs are very, very similar to some of the inputs. It doesn't happen very often, but it's a known fact. And a lot of the litigation in the US and some of the cases there have focused on, well, they focused on watermarks and the featuring of these digital watermarks that have appeared in outputs from the original inputs. So those are the sort of three issues which really underpin the copyright infringement question. And that's really, I guess, where we're going to focus. Anita, rather than me wittering on for too long, can you give us your steer on this from an enterprise perspective as a lawyer at IBM? Where do you think that, for example, the code of practice is the way forward, or something else?
Well, I'd like to see it first, so yeah. We'll be holding comments back until then. But look, in terms of being enterprise-facing, our customers are at that level. So big banks, telco, and it does mean that IBM itself doesn't have large caches of consumer data that we trawl. Our past CEO, Ginny Rometty, with the onset of our Watson tools and technologies, actually made a promise, a public promise, a reassurance to our customers to say your data is your own, which does mean then that data access is a challenge. Yeah. So certainly, TDM, fair use, these copyright exceptions or provisions that provide for access to data we're tracking. In terms of the issues at play, I like the way that everyone's been approaching this in terms of input, solution or model and output. That's a really good way to visualize it. And I would say again, Toby, agree with you that the issues aren't new if you've already been advising your clients as they set up AI models, solutions and tools. Essentially, what is coming into your company, your tool, your model? Do you know its provenance? And I think copyright is one of those issues. Toby, database rights possibly as well. If that content is an image, you could have branding in there, logos, word marks. Patents probably unlikely in the inbound data for simple, raw, textual data, but if it's code, well, software patents could apply. We're a big filer of software patents. As well as the issues that Claudio and Charlie mentioned in terms of security, PI, bias. It can quickly get into quite a minefield. And I think the other issue, Toby, is that there isn't just one IP right and there isn't just one IP framework in terms of laws. So if you're a global business, as we are, and I'm advising technical teams all over the world, it can get pretty complex pretty quickly. I would say just a takeaway, if your clients are looking to use foundation models, AI solutions, if they're developing them, have some good hygiene in place, get some guardrails in place so you can understand what is coming in, the provenance of that, and you can stand behind your output. Again, that shouldn't be new if you're into software development, not just checking for issues around AI, but also security, privacy, possibly code scanning. These are all really good guardrails to try to get a handle on what's going on. And I think, Toby, in terms of the output, what's happening in that model, open questions as to whether the results are derivative, are they a replica, that we're seeing play out in some of the jurisdiction. Certainly the IP officers are talking about this. But again, I would say whilst these are all being discussed in different ways globally, make sure internally you've got good hygiene practices to help with that. I will say in terms of copyright, I know that's where we're focused today, but in terms of output, the DABUS patent applications, I don't know if you've been following those, were filed probably 4 or 5 years ago now, raising the question of AI-generated inventions and whether patents should be granted for that. So that's an interesting analogous discussion. Again, we're following that pretty closely.
It's interesting you say that, because that concerns whether an AI can be named as an inventor of a patent. And it begs the question, by analogy, whether a machine can be an author of a copyright-protected work. Or in other words, can an AI be truly creative? And you might think, well, actually, humans create and AIs generate. And can an AI really be creative? Can it replicate that sort of human creativity in that way? And I think that's quite a challenging question. And I know a few years ago I was at an international conference where we were discussing this very issue around authorship. The UK is a slightly odd jurisdiction in some ways, because we have this provision in the Copyright Act for computer generated works, and it gives a separate shorter period of protection for works where there is no human author. But it's hardly been relied on. So it's interesting to see whether there'll be any mileage in that, I guess. And I've always thought, when I think about these things, should I, as a human, benefit from copyright protection in a very elaborate image that I've produced by typing in a sentence in an AI model? It feels like I'm getting a bit of a windfall if I couldn't, for example, pick up a paintbrush and use it to do that painting myself, or even, you know, things like CAD designs for architecture. Is the nexus between the creativity and the human broken by the use of an AI, and therefore doesn't justify, in a way that, for example, philosophers like Hegel would say, well, you can have copyright in a work because it's an embodiment of your personality and your will. It doesn't feel the same, or, well, I don't think that it feels the same. So does that mean that the time has come to revisit the question as to whether we should have a different right applicable to these sorts of works, so that we're not trying to fit the square peg of copyright into the round hole of an AI-generated invention or work?
I think some of the challenges with that, though, if we take a few steps back, is there isn't, as I know it, an internationally agreed upon definition of AI, or of what we mean by, you know, human involvement when it comes to creating an AI-generated work or invention. What do we actually mean by that?
Yeah.
So I think that's the base level at where I'm starting. And in terms of legislating around this, again, I think guardrails are going to be needed, certainly in certain high-risk use scenarios. But as we can see that the technology is developing so rapidly, and getting ahead of our technologists, putting, you know, jurisprudence or, you know, legislation in place that is then pretty hard to track back from. You know, I don't think that's where we want to end up, but I think certainly having discussions like this with a range of stakeholders and taking the lead from our technologists as well is the way to go on these. But I think many questions still at this stage.
Lilian, is there anything you want to add to this conversation, or are you...
I could add a few things. I'm primarily an AI, e-commerce and data protection lawyer, but there is some crossover here, I think, between the issues that are arising for data protection and for copyright. I can't speak to patent really at all. So a couple of things I've just scribbled down here. You know, this whole discussion about creativity, machines, infringement, and so forth. I mean, various propositions that have been put to me by artists. I was on a panel where there were some very voluble artists complaining about things. But on the other hand, there was another artist who's quite well known in kind of science fiction art called Jim Burns, who's had money thrown at him, who's using it as a tool. I mean, to some extent, like everyone's been saying, this is not that new, and it is a tool. It's better than Photoshop, you know, it's better than Adobe, whatever we've got, but if you are a good artist, you can use it essentially in the way Michelangelo used his team of assistants to really speed up and improve and iterate on your workflow and make a great deal of money. So I think it's a little bit like the handloom weavers, if anyone remembers that from their history grade course. There were handloom weavers whose job was taken away by the invention of the jacquard loom and so forth. But there were others who retrained to use the jacquard looms, and then did quite well. So we are at an inflection point, but I don't think it's death to creativity or death to small artists. Another thing that I'm surprised no one's really mentioned is that I think the art skirmishes are going to be the absolute prequel, to the main event, to the proper Star Wars trilogy, which is going to be the music industry getting involved in this. And we're already seeing this over the last few weeks. And I've been saying for about a year, if you think things are bad, with Getty suing you or a small collection of artists suing you, then just wait till the music industry starts suing you. So I think that's going to be the full 90 minutes game, because we already have so much jurisprudence on sampling and so forth as well. I quite like the UK provision on who makes arrangements for the production of a computer-generated work. And if we're looking for a Brexit bonus, about which I think you can tell my cynicism, that seems a good place to start. If we're one of the only places in the world that's got a semi-reasonable provision on this, then why don't we do a code of practice on that? Because I did 5 minutes research on it and discovered one case. What we really, really need there is some understanding of what it means. Is it the programmer, is it the artist, or is it both? And in what proportions? Which again is a bit like, to some extent, the problem of joint controllership in data protection.
I think that case was about 20 years old as well, isn't it?
It is, and it's not really that apposite to this use case.
Not really, no.
So I think there's all kinds of things there that could be looked at.
Well, it's probably a good moment to move on to our second question. At some point, so we have Sean with us from AutogenAI, and Sean has brought along his language model, and at some point we can, if we want to, type in questions. So I'm just going to make that point now. Our second question is, what does an LLM know? Which is a slightly loaded question because, and I think, Hannah, you touched on this with your question about the human tendency to anthropomorphize AI. What does an LLM know? I would say it doesn't know, it just does. But Claudio, I know this is something that you touched on in your talk. Can you perhaps lead us on this and let us know if you think there is any judgment or understanding in LLM, or if it really just is like what we sometimes call a stochastic parrot?
Even less. I can try. The definition of knowledge does not apply. It's like we cannot think about what they know as the way we know. They don't know. They have not even understanding. There is the way the machine works is creating a representation of the language, which generally is a vector, is a numeric vector. So there is what has been learned is transformed in a series of numbers of 0, 1, that becomes new knowledge the machine leverage to predict the next word. So it does not really know the way we intend knowing. There is an understanding, bracket of how the syntax work, what comes after each single word. But there's no understanding of the content. There is no knowledge of that kind. I don't know if
it's not semantics. It's not syntax only.
Correct. It's only syntax.
Sean, I know that you've got quite a lot of experience with GPT in your line of work. Are LLMs only ever going to be stochastic parrots and not sort of evolve into artificial general intelligence? What's your take on this?
So look, I think there's an interesting piece around whether even just using mathematical regression and deep mathematical regression and deep learning, whether just out of those syntax that semantic emergent properties can't happen when you get to scale. And I don't think that you can just say, just because the machine is operating in this manner, that means it will never get to understanding. Indeed, I mean, a lot of people might suggest that our human brains are doing very similar things, and we tend to grant ourselves consciousness. some people don't. Knowledge is an interesting one. I would say certainly where large language models are, for my money, they don't have knowledge. I mean, take the standard philosophical definition of knowledge as justified true belief. You could make a good case, I think, for justification based on large language models that have read everything and built up their nets through that. And you could definitely get to true statements. Of course, the large language models do produce true statements as well as false statements. But I don't think it makes much sense, and I agree with this, to talk about a large language model having beliefs. So I think that would be the bit for me where clearly large language models don't generate, don't have knowledge. But what strikes me a little bit is we're still asking questions that I think have been solved. And I think that talks to how quickly this technology is moving. The question, can a large language model be creative, is already solved. I can show you examples of a large language model being creative. I could, perhaps we'll take some time to do exactly that. So there's no point having those conversations anymore. In the same way that I think the Turing test has been shown to be an inadequate test of consciousness, because large language models aren't conscious, but they do pass the Turing test in a range of contexts. So I'm not a lawyer and not a regulator, but I have some sympathy with people saying that it is very, very hard for the law and regulation to keep up with this field because it is moving so breathtakingly quickly.
Lilian.
Well, I may be the most cynical on this panel about AGI. I'm not sure. I think we might be in similar feelings about this. For a start off, I wouldn't use the word knowledge at all. I would use information, possibly data, right? And we all know that you can put information into a machine learning model and it can produce new information, right? You can put ordinary data in about how much shopping people do every week at Tesco's for a year, and you can generate what they call NDP sensitive personal data. That somebody may be pregnant, that somebody may be in a relationship with someone else, that someone may be working 4 days a week because they only ever go to Tesco's on a Friday, which isn't sensitive data. But the idea that it can create new information is not my idea of creativity, frankly. And I think what we should do, and I liked the question from over there as well, is my objection, I was just saying, is not so much to terminology that is, I'm afraid, enshrined in AI that is not going to go away about, supervised and unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, et cetera, But my objection, which has been already, exercised by a number of American universities, is that the press, in the same way that the press should not, encourage suicide, the press should not be treating these products as anthropomorphic productions of some mythical AGI. So they should not be saying that the system learns, they should not be saying that the system wrote a poem, they should be saying that a person wrote a poem or a corporation, instructed code using these tools, right? And that is not that hard, so it actually seems to me that there ought to be rules for press and reporters, because we are in danger of, encouraging a degree of credulity or gullibility in a population who mostly aren't technical, especially in the UK.
Do you think that is there too much of a focus on the prospect of artificial general intelligence, and that is driving some of the decisions that are being made, do you think? Or
well, I hope it isn't driving decisions that are being made, frankly, except by Elon Musk.
Well, the pause, I'm thinking of the sort of moratorium on
well, I think we all know that the pause was a device to let Elon catch up, and produce Truth Social or whatever it's called.
I was going to ask for a show of hands on that, but I don't think it's necessary now.
Again, I'm extraordinarily cynical about this. I mean, this is geopolitics. You've got a bunch of very, very rich men who I think don't have enough worries in their life, perhaps. And so they have fixated in a semi-religious tribal way on this idea of existential long-term risk, this effective altruism tribe. And frankly, I think someone said themselves, and as sensible people like Margaret Mitchell have been saying for a long time, we should be concentrating on the things we need to deal with right now, which is everything from, the racial and sexual whatever bias in these systems to climate change, right? Because it's something that hasn't been mentioned so far. I mean, I love large language models. I'm not against them. I love playing with these things. But the truth is, we know that this, after crypto, this is probably the most extreme use of energy that's going to disturb, the sustainability of the planet. And if we get into the kind of issues that I was discussing the last 2 days in other places, where we talk, and I'm a DP rights person, if we talk about the right of erasure of your data from the model, from OpenAI, from ChatGPT, whatever, that could mean in strict law that you have the right to require that model to be retrained, which is something that takes several weeks and uses vast amounts of compute and energy. This is not a good idea. Right, so again, I think, as a lawyer, we've got to be proportional about the legal remedies that we provide and enable, and scale them proportionately to other societal interests, which include, not fooling people with AGI, but also include saving the planet from climate change. Yeah. So I think we need a more holistic view on this, and also don't believe the hype.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next question? This is, will LLM take my job or provide me with assistance in doing it? Which one? Anita, do you want to kick off from, an enterprise perspective, what your take on that question is?
Yeah, sure. I love all my LinkedIn contacts playing around with ChatGPT. I think the recent one was trying to get it to write some patent applications. So I hope it didn't do it too well. Otherwise, I would be out of a job. I just think this is a natural debate when there's any disruptor on the scene. That could be politically, economy, or a technology. It's just natural to say, what is this going to do for me and my job and the way I make my living. Our CEO, Arvind Krishna, he's our current CEO, was in the press last week, and his spin on this was more positive. And turned it back into a question to say, what are you getting, what are you doing to get ready for this wave? How are you going to embrace it? Because I think we've been talking about some of the examples, maybe Sean, you could show us, but we can't deny that these tools are here. They're only going to develop further and become more entrenched in our professional and personal lives. So I would say it's down to each and every one of us, either to improve our skills or even to up skills to embrace this. You're all investing in your careers today. It's really great to see. I think it's very easy to say it's HR's problem or talent acquisition have got this covered, but it's our responsibility. I would say, as well as investing in ourselves, please, I'm going to make a plea, think about that next generation, right? We owe it to them. I think in terms of STEM, the take-up, I was talking to you, Lilian, very difficult still in the UK. If you have some skills and passion and you have in-house scheme to do with STEM initiatives, return to work initiatives, please think of going into the office tomorrow and signing up. Doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, but I do think we owe it to that next gen so that the current and future jobs, prompt engineer is all over LinkedIn now, that they're open to all.
It's probably a good point to put the question to Sean, who I'm sure you're going to tell me that it augments jobs, it doesn't take them away. Is that right?
So we were the first company in the UK to recruit prompt engineers. Yeah. So T.O. was my first prompt engineer. So she was the first prompt engineer in the UK, and now she gives talks to.
I've read all about them.
And comes from a philosophy background, not a mathematical background or an engineering background, because it turns out when you're dealing with large language, I mean, who would have thought that the programming language of the 21st century was English? And that is genuinely remarkable. I'm really conflicted talking about this because it's an area which encompasses so many different perspectives and needs so many disciplines. You need to be, a mathematician. You need to be a computer scientist. You need to be a philosopher. You need to be an English literature graduate. You need to be a historian. This plays into so many areas. Let me say a couple of things. So one is the notion I don't for 1 second believe that large language models are the route to artificial general intelligence. I don't think we're years away or decades away. I fundamentally think artificial general intelligence is well out of my lifetime. And I 100% agree that there's a massive amount of hype in the space, and you know, the hype by capitalists who are trying to, you know, get extortionate valuations on their businesses, and of course it pays them to overhype this technology and suggest that we're all going to be replaced by this singularity. I do genuinely think that's science fiction nonsense. However, this tech is going to change everything. You know, kind of, right? It is, and my argument for that is not a science fiction argument. It's an argument from history, and I think it's a historical argument that you need to turn to. And my argument is essentially that the technology that changes everything, one is it does something fundamental to human existence, and two, it speeds it up many, many times faster than you could do it before. So if you look at the abacus speeds up arithmetic and multiplication many times, and that allows you to add up faster and multiply faster, but fundamentally that makes complex trade possible. The printing press makes the sharing of ideas faster. That leads to the Reformation, that leads to the Renaissance, that leads to the scientific revolution, which leads to the industrial revolution, which leads to the steam engine. What does the steam engine do? The steam engine allows you to power stuff faster. Locomotion, but factories kind of critically. The internet in some of our lifetimes, I look around in my lifetime, the internet, what does it do? It allows the sharing of ideas so much faster. All of these inventions change the world because they do something fundamentally human very, very quickly. Large language models allow you to create and then share through the internet. But they allow you to create ideas, text, images, like multitudes of times faster than humans can do it. And that is going to change everything. Not because it's artificial general intelligence, but because it's a technology which does something fundamentally human much faster than we can do it. To play that to that point, all of those technologies, and again, I'd suggest looking at the history is really interesting, and looking at the history of how those technologies were regulated. Radioactivity is discovered, right, in the late 19th century. When does it get properly regulated? 1946, right, because it's been used to end the Second World War with the dropping of 2 bombs, right? But it's been there for a long time. People are using it in medical applications. People are using it all over the place, and it's this fundamental piece. Electricity, the history of the regulation of electricity is fascinating. And with all of those technologies, printing press, or you look at the internet, it doesn't destroy jobs, but it massively changes what humans need to do. And then I would completely agree. We need to look at how do you retrain people? How do you allow all areas of society to access those jobs and access those jobs equally? How do you make sure that people don't get left behind? And I think those are all very, very real policy questions where governments would be, spend good use spending their time. And indeed, tech billionaires might actually spend their time and resources.
Claudio, it's an interesting comment, Sean. So acceleration, have you seen that in the coding industry with like Copilot, things like that? Is that really accelerating the sort of pace of change and the speed of development?
Yeah, it's one of the applications that it's going to change the world, or at least our world. We don't use it because it's not for everyone. Yeah. But if you embrace the technology, yes, I'm not really a fan. I have a romantic approach to coding. I think it's like when you write, we all follow the same rules, but we all write in different ways, and coding is similar to that, at least in my experience as a former coder. So I'm not really a great fan, but it does improve the quality of the code and the way the code is standardized, and does facilitate the work of people that do build machine learning. You apply the same kind of complexity. The code, the machine has learned on code that has seen already in the past, so there's the same amount of the same kind of bias that you, or limitations that you can apply to everything else. So the answer is yes. Maybe not right now. I think when they will deploy the latest innovation, it will perform much better. The solutions that are out there now, at least in our experience, are not good enough for the kind of development that we do.
I mean, just hearing the responses to the questions, it feels like actually maybe there is a net benefit, and this is just progress, and that we shouldn't all be worried. There may be some pain going through the sort of transition towards embracing the technology. But Lilian, would you agree?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think various people here know more about this than me, and I haven't got the historical perspective down there in detail, but I agree. I mean, if you just look at, the history we've lived through ourselves, along came word processors, and you think, it's going to make the secretaries all lose their jobs, and 10, 20 years later, what's happened? I and every other professional are working 3 times harder than we should, doing all our own secretarial work. But essentially, the IT revolution has made far, far, far more jobs than we ever dreamt of. And some of those people who were working as secretaries, and I use that word deliberately rather than administrator, which you would use now, have retrained and have acquired much more skills and much better jobs and much better futures for themselves and their families, and some probably haven't. And I think that's what you find. So I absolutely echo what you're saying. Some jobs go, many more are created, but there isn't always the people whose jobs went who got the new jobs. And the place I think where I differ a little from you maybe is that I don't think we can just rely on people like, getting on their own bike. There are people who are systemically discriminated against for economic reasons, for historical reasons, for family reasons, and more has to be done to enable these people to get involved. And indeed, the first IT revolution, you might say, has bypassed these people, because we are talking as if everyone in the world is playing with ChatGPT, and certainly everyone I know is, in my little filter bubble. But there's still, 10% of people in this very rich country still who are completely digitally, disempowered, excluded, right? And generally, disproportionately, those who are already disempowered or excluded in various other ways, so multiple deprivation results. And I just think we should keep that in mind. Depressingly.
So perhaps we should move on to our 4th and final question, which is, will an LLM, no, that's the one that I've just done, how can we all make AI safe, ethical and accountable? So how can we make all AI safe, ethical and accountable? Charlie's already addressed some of the regulatory challenges. So I guess one of the big questions that falls out of this broader question is data privacy. Lilian, do you want to pick that one up?
Yes. Where to start? I mean, one thing I would say is I would start with making AI legal, before I started to get on to making it ethical and accountable. I'm not saying these are 2 separate things. They're obviously interlocking Venn diagrams. But again, we should be on the guard for this, because this language of ethical and safe has, if not invented by, has very much been co-opted by some of these tech giants and other companies to establish a self-regulatory paradigm. Leave it to us. We can do it with our own internal rules, our own codes of conduct. And sadly, historically, that has not proven to be the case, to be a true aspiration. So I think what we're seeing in Europe is a realization that there does need to be regulatory control, both to create innovation and to guard and create a more trustworthy AI society, okay? So, data privacy. I mean, where do you start? I mean, I think Charlie, went through some of the obvious points. In a way, this is an apocalypse that was waiting to happen. This is what I said earlier today. It isn't just about generative AI, it's about machine learning in general. I mean, we know, because this came over really from the US, where they didn't have federal data protection law, where they had a much more limited conception of what personal data was, and where particularly they had a doctrine that if it was out there in public, it was fair game, right? And that still persists. I went and looked up the new California Consumer Protection Privacy Law to see, and it still has that in there, that if it's been made public, you can grab it. It doesn't have the protections. I was quite surprised. So that is what generative AI is fundamentally based on, which is what you've given us a very good description of. But it's a problem that also already existed with many machine learning systems, that there wasn't a lawful ground for the processing. Because if you don't have consent, which certainly for the size of the data sets you're talking in AGI, not in AGI, God, in generative AI, the machines are getting to me. then consent's going to be impossible to obtain. And I think that's true even with lots of conventional machine learning that we see in places like Facebook, for example, or Google spiders. And so the European Court of Justice has actually put a lot of energy into trying to avoid this kind of apocalypse. So some people here might know of the Google Spain case several years back now that introduced the right to be forgotten. And one of the issues bubbling under in that case is actually, was Google legal? The search engine Google, was it legal? Because it sends out spiders to copy a great deal of the internet without permission, right? And the European Court of Justice managed to sort of finagle that by saying, well, you can't get consent, and we're not sure if it's legitimate interest because the economic interest of Google does not outweigh, and they really had to say this or throw in the towel, does not outweigh the severe incursion into privacy that is going on here by the hoovering up of your personal data, right? But then they said, but society benefits because there is this huge public interest in us having access to the internet, and we can't manage if we can't use search engines, right? And then they go on to say, this is not quite how it's written before I get shouted at from the front, but this is the narrative drive of Google Spain, is that, okay, so far we've got a bit of a score draw, We've got big incursion into the privacy of data subjects, we've got public interest in being able to understand and make the internet legible. So what are we going to do to break the tie, as it were? We're going to make Google provide these rights to all of us to say we don't want to be involved in this, to say we want our rights of erasure, we want our rights to be forgotten, we want our rights to rectify the inaccurate data that might be sitting in Google, that might be destroying our jobs and our salaries and our reputations. And if Google can give us those, we'll let them get on with it, right? That's essentially what Google Spain kind of did, and it's kind of worked. There is then another iteration of this about sensitive personal data, which I won't go into because it's horrible. And I think we're going to see a similar round of bargaining in the big courts, the Supreme Courts of Europe, of the US, of the UK, in the next few years. I mean, I don't know how long it will take, because the bottom line is Europe and the UK do not want to ban generative AI. They do not want to be the region that doesn't have all these golden geese when the US and China and India are steaming on with them, right? So I just think it is going to be a very, I don't know how many people in this room are clients or lawyers or what, but there's going to be a lot of work. Because, I was saying this to someone from DeepMind yesterday. This needs an enabling approach, a commercial approach, if you like, even where it deals with consumers. Because we have to find solutions. We have to find solutions which adequately balance the public interest and individual rights. We do not want to live in a world where everyone has signed away their privacy. You have zero privacy, get over it. Remember that? That is not what the world wants now. That is not what Gen Z wants. It's very clear. The world has changed. But at the same time, we don't want to lose innovation and prosperity and fun, right? And creativity. So it's going to be up to us, she says evangelically. I feel quite strongly about this after 2 days of giving talks, to find the legal solutions that will work. Okay? Was that the answer?
Yeah,
it's drifted in various directions.
I guess regulation, can regulation be the answer? I think you're saying that there has to be a sort of a commercial solution as well.
I am, but I'm not saying a self-regulatory solution.
Yeah.
Because it can't go against, your code of conduct for copyright can't actually go against the positive law, right?
No.
It can only explain it, it can only illustrate it, it can only give, case studies.
We'll have to see what the IPO come up with in the summer, though, before
but they can't actually, go against the basic rules of copyright. They have to repeal them. So I think that the European approach to regulation, by which I no longer include the UK, is that regulation should safeguard fundamental rights and make AI trustworthy and, regard the humanity of people. I think that's all good, and I think the UK should do it too. But I also do respect, the view of the UK that we've got to make money out of something, and what we've got is data and AI and creativity and ingenuity. And we are actually well placed to try and make these work. It is a shame, this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you ask the next question. It is a shame that we have basically put our eggs in the baskets of AI and the creative industries. And right now, they are in a fight to the death. So I find this quite amusing in a rather sans-foi way.
Sean, do you think, I mean, is education the answer to make AI safe, ethical and accountable, or are there other things that you can think of?
Yeah, look, I think education's absolutely right, and as I say, I'm by no means a regulatory expert. I mean, I would agree with general principles like people regulating themselves is not a very sensible approach generally. There's all sorts of. I mean, there's some interesting stuff around. I was speaking the other day, someone had reminded me about financial regulation, and I thought I think some really interesting parallels with large language models and the financial crisis in 2008. Financial crisis in 2008, of course. Caused by primarily by these collateralized debt obligations. And it wasn't just that the regulators didn't understand collateralized debt obligations, the companies flogging them and buying them didn't understand them either. So, and I think there is a huge knowledge gap in AI and a huge knowledge gap in large language models. And with the advent of ChatGPT, we've seen this sort of whole area go bang, but it is still the general level of discourse on large language models on LinkedIn or in the media is woeful. Like even in those sorts of areas where the level of discourse is generally woeful, it is particularly woeful in this area. So I do think there's a key piece for that. But then I'm heartened by, kind of actually if you talk to a couple of teenagers, they're all using large language models for their homework, and actually, kind of again, people are a little bit more, sort of open and smart, start to adapt very quickly and start to learn themselves, and they can then quickly tell the difference between fact and fiction because, they're actually experiencing it. So, sort of obviously, very clear risks and clear role for sensible and proportionate regulation by government, and there's a role for all of us involved in this space is to try and help educate legislators and the media and do everything we can to try and explain what this stuff is and what it isn't.
I think it's a complex picture actually that can involve multifaceted solutions. I think regulation, maybe focusing on the high risk use cases as the EU Act has been doing, that makes sense. I don't think it should be left to big tech to sort out. Absolutely need the voices of startups and SMEs and academia as well. But in terms of ethics, again, one thing I want to relay, if your clients are setting up AI companies, are wanting to bring it in internally, we've actually had an ethics board since 2018. And so it's open to everyone in IBM across all business units, and our technologists bring use cases to the board. And it's not a question of whether we could do them, it's also whether we should do them. Yeah. It's not a rubber stamp of approval, not every use case gets approved. Having some governance, right, and structure and frame like that, having AI officers that are accountable for their technology and their business cases and their customers. One thing that we do, I think, as an AI provider, a large one, there's a sense of responsibility that comes with that. So it's working with external companies to also, get them involved in the debate. Signed the Rome Call of AI ethics a few years ago. I've been doubled down on that this year. And I want to pick up the person who mentioned open tech and open data, because I think along with standards, standardization Charlie and I have been talking about, that's another part of the puzzle, right? Getting those voices around the table, getting some consistency on what we even mean by AI ethics. So I do think that's going to be a critical part of implementation moving forward. So good point raised.
Lilian, can you talk to us a bit about contractual regulation?
Yeah, it's just occurred to me that this might be a particular interest to this group. is, you know, certainly me as an academic, and I think some of us will always think about the obvious top-down pillars of regulation. So at the moment, that is things like the AI Act, copyright, the GDPR, you know, possibly various planks of the DSA and the DMA, the Digital Services Act, and so forth, or even the Online Safety Bill. God help us if it ever actually happens.
Don't go there.
Yeah, really, I'm not going there. But actually, you know, in commercial world, as I think we all know, what we have done historically is mitigated risk with contractual terms. And I think, again, there's going to be a great deal of work in that, you know? I mean, if you take, I don't know, just randomly, if you take the new Chinese law that basically puts all the risk on the provider, I would have thought even in China, they will want to mitigate that risk by transferring it down with indemnities or so forth to their downstream deployers of their technology, yeah? Now, sometimes that won't be allowed. And one of the interesting things that's crept into the EU AI Act in the last week or so, I mean, honestly, it's like watching a really good series at the moment. You know, every week there's something new and exciting, is that they've anticipated this, and they've stuck in something about how the top level providers, so say OpenAI, should not be able to impose really unfair contractual clauses on their downstream deployers. I think I haven't had time to look at it properly. This is both consumers and other types of commercial downstream deployers. So there is a lot of interesting work, I think, to be done here by lawyers and by commercial lawyers in trying to think about, and this is the kind of self-regulation I sort of do approve of, in how companies present to the world transparency and regulation and rights in their own, you know, privacy policies, terms of service, acceptable use policies. And the reason why I'm so exercised about this is because I got some money that fell down the back of the couch this year to, almost literally, to do 3 months work with a couple of very bright PhDs, looking at the terms of service of various models, which seems to me to be really crucial work that no one was doing, right? So we tried to, and it turns out that, you know, that all this does is make you realize that it's at least a 3-year project, right? But we did start to look at the privacy policies and the terms of use and the acceptable use policies of a random selection of models, right? So, you know, obviously ChatGPT, but also some Chinese models, because we had someone who spoke Chinese, which was helpful. Also some image generators, and we took a selection from the legal sector for downstream deployers. And the overwhelming impression I haven't had time remotely to go through this properly yet, I hope it will come out as a report that would be interesting to you guys, is that people so far are surprised, apart from the real biggies like OpenAI or Google, are using boilerplate clauses that they got off the internet and that aren't even remotely relevant to or covering all the risks and transparencies and obligations that you would like to see in place, let alone thinking about the stuff that would help them, you know, such as exclusions of liability or indemnity clauses or insurance clauses or so forth and so on. So it does seem to me we're in year 0 of this.
I feel like I should rub my hands together here.
Yes, see the dollar signs appearing overhead. You know, if anyone wants to talk to me, my consultancy rates are cheaper than theirs. Sorry.
We offer substantial discounts.
I'll arm wrestle.
I concede. Yeah.
I think it's fun times, actually. I'm curiously cheerful about all this.
How are we doing for time, Chris?
You're under time, my friend. You've got 20 minutes until 50:30.
Okay, so
you might want to start.
We want some questions, possibly.
Yeah.
Shall we open up for questions?
I think you should.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for your responses. Let's take some questions. So, anyone have any questions? Hands up. Right, that man there, he put his hand up first. Your question, please.
You briefly touched on this. Hi there. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yep. You briefly touched on this earlier in the talk about prompt engineering. I'm curious as to what your predictions are for the future of the growing industry of prompt engineering and how we as, I guess, employers, businesses, and even employees prepare for that. Yeah.
Sean?
Would you like me to ask
Why
the
not
model.
ask ChatGPT? Oh, sorry,
Okay.
no.
I will not be asking
Oh,
ChatGPT.
no.
It's the second time I've made that mistake today.
So I will ask. I'm going to ask a couple of models. I'm going to ask the first. So this is our general large, our general language engine. What we call it Geni 1. What is the future for prompt engineering in AI in, I don't know, the UK? Was that something along those lines for the question? And then again, I mean, you can ask large language models to be reasonably creative. So we just asked that question, and so research into the use of AI-driven automation, predictive maintenance engineering. It quite likes engineering. It hasn't quite got prompt engineering. See, this is the problem with using a model which is trained on data up until 2020. Let me ask it on a slightly different. So what we're going to do here is use generative AI instead to mash up answers from the internet and get past some of the hallucination problems that we've heard of. What we call in my business the Boris Johnson problem when we first started talking about it about 12 months ago. So that actually gives you a kind of a better kind of model. So prompt engineering is emerging field in AI. Prompts again, but it talks about ChatGPT again. Don't worry, we'll fix that.
It wasn't just me.
We'll fix that as we go forward. But this starts to give you some idea of the sort of power of large language models. If we asked kind of maybe a question which is slightly less focused on the prompt engineering, but what jobs will be replaced by AI, something like that. Again, something where you get a more general type response. And again, this isn't looking up any information. We had a few questions earlier. I was listening backwards about how this finds us. It isn't actually looking anything up. It's making random words up based on previous words that have come up. So it's a logarithmic. It's a regression model. It's doing this complex soup of linear algebra essentially. So that just gives you some idea about how large language models are able to be come up with ideas, and it's not searching this, it's not finding this information on an internet site anywhere. It is literally just creating these ideas out of statistical associations between words.
Please do, yeah.
Well, there are already a lot of jobs out there for this specific role. It's not just writing a prompt. It's understanding. He's a software engineer that knows also other stuff on top of it. So it's going to be a more complex kind of work. It's not just being very good at writing things that the machine then ingests. It's understanding how the machine has been built, that you can go around and you can stress the machine, you can challenge the machine to the point that you get what you want.
I think that's kind of that's kind of a key point. I think if you again, if we if you ask write me a sentence, right? That is a prompt. Write me a sentence. Right? It's something that the prompt engineer does, and then we can literally just ask a large language model to write a sentence. And again, if people will tell you that AI can't be creative, I suggest to you that AI can be creative. But you can, but then prompting this, write me a long, interesting sentence, right? Now that is a different prompt. This is literally what prompt engineering is, right? And you start to then change those ideas, and it then starts to come up with different ideas for you. So the way you talk to these large language models makes a big difference to the material that they're able to come up with. And I would suggest to you, clearly exhibit signs of creativity. These are brand new sentences. These sentences do not exist anywhere. Right? You can Google search these sentences, and you simply won't find them. This doesn't exist. This doesn't exist, right? It's generated text. It's really people often. So we get all the time. People ask us, "Where's the computer getting this information from?" It isn't getting information. is making up sentences based on statistical correlation of words which it's read before, and actually to the point around it's read everything, like, you know, kind of pretty much everything that's ever been written.
And websites.
Pretty much, yeah, I'd suggest to you it's read pretty much. The bits it hasn't read are the bits you deliberately don't want it to read.
Well, for example, it hasn't read One Hope's health data, because that's confidential and behind, walls. It hasn't read stuff behind paywalls. It hasn't read confidential trade secrets in most large commercial companies. So it actually has really big gaps. I mean, I'm not saying it as I love this stuff, I love it, but I can give you an anecdote, right? When I was preparing all these talks, I got my mate, who's obsessed with Midjourney, to make me all these pictures of stochastic parrots. This is what I thought my brand would be. So for a large model, it would be a stochastic parrot, it would be a parrot, and there would be pictures of the parrot ingesting data, and there would be pictures of the parrot in a UK flag, and there would be pictures of the parrot in a Chinese flag, so very like the slide you did and so forth. Lots of parrots, right? And eventually I said, can we have one of someone reaching in and getting their personal data out of the parrot, right? He could not make Midjourney generate that. And that's not because he's bad at this, he's very good at it, right? It's because that is not something that you commonly find in the pixels, really, of the giant training sets, right? And it just would not generate that. The nearest we got to it was someone holding a mobile phone near the parrot, because presumably there are lots of pictures of people recording their pet parrots, right? So in the end, I didn't use that. Whereas I could have got a graphic designer, I know a few, to run that up in minutes. So the creativity, what you're saying really, is very limited. It's surprisingly limited by what is common in our society. Yeah, and the true original spark of creating something that is not common in our society will remain important, which is one of the reasons why I think artists aren't in as bad a state as they're going on about. Artists who do cliches, I'm going to get into trouble now, such as people who do, typical science fiction art, are in trouble because there's a vast amount of it on these websites, and therefore it's very, very easy to create using Midjourney and DALL-E 2. So that shows up perhaps a lack of originality in the artist, as opposed to, the destruction of creative life by the machine. Okay.
So there's three sorts of creativity that we talk to. And by the way, I fundamentally agree that these are tools that humans can use to create, and of course, they are, of course, slaves to their previous...
slaves to the algorithm.
Slaves to the previous data, yeah, absolutely. But I think a good conceptual framework for creativity comes in three areas. So one is creativity which pushes the boundaries of a subject. So you take something that's been done before, but you take it a step further or two steps further. The second sort of creativity, which actually language models doing language are remarkable at, is when you mix concepts from different areas. And large language models, so if you ask what lessons can we have about reducing reoffending in a prison from running a call centre, it will come up with some really very genuinely, and I would challenge you not to think of them as innovative, creative, new, genuinely novel ideas.
Or if you ask it to do a picture of a toilet in Bromwich in the style of Klimt.
Yes,
which is not something Klimt would ever have painted. It's very, very good at that. It's very good at pastiche.
Shall we move on to another question? I think...
Sorry.
Please.
We're having questions.
Why when you put the same prompt in, can you give you radically different answers, given that it's supposed to be based on statistics?
Like if you roll a dice,
yeah,
it will give you a
it's
different
not
number.
Yeah. This is probably really new.
The same random seed, it's the same answer. It is a probabilistic approach, right? If you have this, which starts with a random step, if the random seed, if the seed is the same, the answer should be the same. If it changes, then it should change. So yes, it's a probabilistic approach. Will just
put the same prompt in twice.
Well, the way they work now is you might expect different answers. But the model, if you have a model that is predicting next word and use the same random seed at the beginning of the process, you should end up with the same result. You might end up with the same result.
If you think, well, the models are trained to predict the next word. based on what they've read, publicly available data. Kind of say the models are trained to predict the next word, and so if you but when you predict the next word, you can either have the next word which is the most probable, but of course in language there's probably lots and lots of different words which are all equally probable or nearly equally probable. So what the large language models do is they randomly pick one of those probable next words. And once you randomly pick a probable next word, and then from that next word randomly pick another probable next word, and then randomly pick another probable next word, the chances of you getting 2 sentences are the same by the time you've got to like 20 words are astronomically low.
At the back there.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see how you would view creativity in the context of something like AlphaGo, which was potentially so creative, no one actually understood it. And while it might be a probabilistic type of creativity, so no one actually knew, I think that's quite creative to solve a game that no human understands. Do we inherently... Are we applying creativity in a human context, whereas perhaps we miss the point that maybe we are inherently ourselves creative in a probabilistic way? Music is inherent fractions, essentially. So when someone composes a piece of music, maybe it's probabilistic that when they've composed it, it really was an internal algorithm. So I think perhaps human arrogance could be getting in the way of what potentially could be unseen creativity. So just a viewpoint, what do you think?
I think games are fundamentally different to language. I think this is really actually important for large language models and natural language processing. The criteria about whether a Go move was right is whether it wins or not. So when you train those engines, you get them to play themselves zillions of times and win. I'm definitely not I know how to play Go. That's about it. But clearly human masters saw creativity and saw what if you anthropomorphize would pass for imagination in some of those Go moves. As I believe Alpha Chess is similar in terms of coming up with moves that human grandmasters say look genuinely creative. Whether a sentence is creative or not, whether a piece of music is good, I think that is fundamentally, there isn't a game to say that that's right or not. I think the only criteria we've got for whether a poem is good or a piece of music is good or we like something is our own judgment on that. It is kind of, we are reserving that a human thinks this is good. If a computer thinks it's good, I don't really care. I care whether a human thinks the writing's good or the poem is good.
Anyone else got anything to add to that?
I might, but I am out of my... So like, I'm a simple person. I'm a geographer by background, and I have no creativity, and I became a data scientist because that just happened. The difference, I think, is... I can explain that next talk. I think the difference is very much like, if you have a machine that has never been trained on music or images, will not be able to give you this information no matter what, because it has never seen it. Has never seen a pixel, has never seen that pixel, has never seen a sound. If you take a human being and you isolate maybe the human being for, I don't know, from birth, it might still be possible that this person will generate music. It's a difference, it's a spark that is missing in the machine in the end. Yeah. So you don't have this initial thing that is going to create something new the way we imagine it as new. But we have new composition of old.
But, I mean, I think if I can again add my cynical point of view, this is a bit of a religious argument, and it's interesting in the way that religious arguments are, because we don't know how to compare the creativity of humans with the creativity of large language models, because we don't know how humans are creative. We don't. We were setting up neural networks. We were putting electrons through the brains of mice. You can put things into people's brains and things will spark. But fundamentally, we can only rely on behaviorism. We observe behavior and we term it to be human or to be creative, right? And that's really what the Turing test was about. And we've already established that the Turing test on external behavior does not identify a human from a machine anymore, right? So behaviorism has failed, and as I understand, very, very outmoded in psychology. So we can't argue about this except on a philosophical level. We can't argue about it empirically. And therefore, I suppose I question whether it's useful. Let's just enjoy these products. But we have to, make up rules about copyright, which requires us to maybe invent legal fictions about what creativity or originality are. But we're used to that in law, right? We can do legal fictions. It doesn't mean we have to believe them.
No. Are there any other questions? Please.
One of the applications of generative AI at the moment is them being incorporated into group chat functionalities or services that allow you to kind of collaborate with other people, so that you could potentially in the chat ask, create an image about a particular shoe that we're trying to think of, or write a poem for the group. Within that environment, you're likely to get people use and include personal data. You could be talking about yourself, an issue that you're facing. How do you then prevent, or can you prevent, because that generative AI model is learning from those conversations, it's improving from those conversations because it's trying to better itself within the parameters of the service that's embedded in. So can you technically prevent it from taking into account personal data in that environment? And if you can't do it technically, can you think of legal ways of trying to kind of limit the risk of it ingesting all of that personal data?
Shall I start on that?
Go for it.
I mean, it might be more of a practical question in a way in the commercial sphere, but it seems to me that there's a lot of kind of stuff around that I would have to understand to give that advice, right? I mean, if you're talking about running a service via an API from, say, OpenAI, then the question is going to be what the terms of service are now. And my understanding is that at least since GPT-4, they've undertaken that the data you put in will not be used to retrain the model. Yeah?
It's the service model will be the other way around. So rather than API being implemented into ChatGPT, for instance, it's actually ChatGPT or generative AI code being embedded into a chat service. So I can't remember the name of the exact service itself, but if you imagine something like Discord, having a bot in Discord, which is based on large language model, so that within Discord, when you're trying to work within an environment of 30, 40 odd people, you could start asking it questions by going @bot, and that question basically asks it to generate something, and it can do that. But it can do that based on the conversation that's been happening within that actual Discord server. So it can read and interpret and learn from the conversations as they are happening in order to then make suggestions, create stuff. So in that environment, how do you stop it from actually...
In some ways, that sounds like a very old-fashioned DP question, where you need the consent of the people in the conversation. Or else you say, if you come into this conversation, by joining the conversation, you are agreeing to this, which is slightly more dodgy because that isn't really kind of explicit, valid consent. But it's a start, So in some ways, I think that's a very old-fashioned idea, because we're used to using multiple sources of data to create things, and we have ways of dealing with it. There will be still more problems if one of those people then says, I want to erase my personal data from this product, which is, I think is the difficult one, or even I want to rectify some kind of assertion that's come out that's based on my personal data. Maybe it's saying something libelous about me, the bot. Maybe it's saying I'm gay when I'm not, and then you get into, I think, really quite difficult problems. And I was going to say to the gentleman there that this idea of the prompt producing different results, which is even more so with images, is the death to the idea of rectification, right, in the GDPR. Because you can put a filter in to say that you don't want one result anymore because it's wrong. But the next time you ask it something similar, a different wrong thing will happen. Right? So I actually think, although it's a tiny thing, that the right to rectification, the right to make your data accurate, is actually the one that so far I have not been able to think of an answer to. And if there are any data protection lawyers here who have, then I would really like to hear it.
This comes really to education for me. I think the notion that you can take a large language model and that it might say something untrue is, of course, it's just making. If I write a computer program that let's take being gay is not gay, and it randomly picks one of those two, and then I put someone's name in and then run the program, it will say is gay or is not gay. I mean, it's kind of, that is what a large language model is doing. It's randomly it's randomly picking something. So,
but can I just, because this is a great example of what I was saying before. I agree with you. We all ought to understand that these models hallucinate. We ought to take it very much into account, and anyone building it for legal clients very, very much should take that into account and make sure, you know, that they have human checking before any of it goes out as a contract or insertion or anything. But on the other hand, what you're saying about education does not take away from the fact that somebody can sue somebody for libel. Right? You have not changed the law of the land by stating a common law understanding of the technology, right? This is what I was saying about copyright. And at least until we get past this blip stage and change all the laws, which I do not see happening anytime soon, you're gonna have to live with that realization. Legal discourse is not the same, it's common sense.
But I think, again, on a practical level, because there have been instances of employees inputting trade secret meeting notes and blueprints into ChatGPT, you know, rather than over-regulating it or relying too much on the tool providers to filter it, I would again say it goes back to basic good hygiene, guardrails and processes, and informing and educating and communicating to your employees.
These, I mean, if you think about what is a large language model? If you take GPT-3, and we don't know much about GPT-4 because OpenAI didn't tell kind of like much about it.
Which is another problem.
Which is definitely a problem. But if you look at GPT, it's a 175 billion parameter language model. Now, it's really easy to say that, right? So what is a 175 billion parameter model? That means there's 175 billion numbers, right? And those are numbers between minus 1.8 billion and plus 1.8 billion. Right? So there's 175 billion numbers, which are somewhere between minus 1.8 billion and plus 1.8 billion. When you type in some data or somebody says it's nicked my photo or my piece of art, that means that parameter number 174,596 has gone from plus 8 to plus 7. Right? It is preposterous to talk about trying to get data out of that. It's the classic, and to put it in a more, I guess, human philosophical context, if you nick one person's kind of like source, it's plagiarism. If you nick 1,000 sources, it's research, right? This is just the deepest research machine.
I'm afraid it is not preposterous, and there is going to be a lot of money hanging on it and a lot of litigation, I'm afraid. You know, this is a very classic kind of geek fallacy. If I explain to everybody the way the world really is, then they'll all agree. That's not kind of how it works.
It's a classic lawyer fallacy. Here's the way we can make some money out of making it complicated.
I think we've probably reached the end of our time now. We'll pause. We'll pause there.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think please put your hands together for the panelists.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, I thought you'd like to
A tremendous discussion, and I'd like to thank also Charlie for speaking as well. Thank you all for coming. I'd also thank the Bristows marketing and BD team, especially Alia and Charlotte for doing all the things. But yes, thank you very much for coming. Drinks, canapes outside, and we're 1 minute late. So well done us. Thank you.